this video, we are going to take a look at AngularJS services. As part of this video, you are going to learn on developing custom services in various ways using factory, service, and provider-oriented methodologies. So let us dig into Angular services. The first thing is service. What exactly is a service here? It is a special unit of code which can be used across different controllers. So you can see we have the controllers in a module. So I can have multiple controllers like controller 1, controller 2, controller 3 which are sitting inside the module. However, if you'd like to have some code which can be used by all of those controllers or any of those controllers or more than one controller, you can provide that particular code right inside this particular service. So service is a separate unit of code which can be used by multiple controllers if necessary. Services can usually be utilities or business logic units. So which means whenever you are writing any kind of code as part of a service, you have to consider that code to be almost independent of that particular controller. So which means whatever the code you are going to write as part of a service usually will be belonging to some kind of utility based code or some business logic related code. So whenever I say business logic, most likely it might be really communicating with a web service, retrieving the results, and then passing back the information to the respective controller. So whenever you have any kind of business logic that needs to be made available as part of a service but not in the controller, the controllers are really meant to receive the data and to provide the data to the views. These controllers need to be as thin as possible and as light as possible. All the heavy lifting needs to be done via service. A service is a singleton. So whenever I say singleton, basically you are going to have only one instance of a particular service to be served across your entire application. So that is a bit different from the controller. So controller usually will be created or instantiated whenever it is needed, and at the same time those could be destroyed whenever we are actually moving to some other route or whenever we are trying to have some other views to be displayed. So controllers can be actually dynamic in nature. However, services are always static, which means once an instance of service has been created, the same instance will be living as part of AngularJS memory, and the same particular instance will be reused across all of the controllers and throughout your particular AngularJS application. So that is very important. There will be only one instance of service which will be served across your entire module or entire app. Services are loaded and instantiated lazily. So this is a bit different from that of the controllers. Controllers, they will be immediately created the moment you actually ask a particular view to be created. So which means if your particular view has got a reference to a controller, that controller will be created instantaneously. But services, as I mentioned, those are not quite related to any of those controllers, and that is the reason services are not instantiated by default. But whenever a controller refers to a service and that particular controller is in use, which means the controller is getting instantiated for some particular scenario, immediately the service gets instantiated if it is not instantiated earlier. So this is pretty important. So whenever a controller refers to a service and whenever the controller gets instantiated, the service will also be getting instantiated if it is not instantiated earlier. So if it is already instantiated earlier, then the controller will be reusing the same instance which has been instantiated earlier. Okay. The next thing is that it is not necessary that you might be having only one service. You can have multiple number of services here. So a module can contain any number of services, and all of those particular services can be used by one or more controllers. So in this case, you can see all of these controllers are using service 1 and also service 2. So as long as you have a service, that particular service can be really used by any of those controllers, and you can have multiple services as part of your application. And there is one more thing. The services can also call or work with other services. So the service, as I mentioned earlier, will be usually used by controller. But the service can also be used by other services. So which means if there is some business logic available in this service one, you can also execute the same business logic from here and vice versa. So you can reuse that particular code of a service available in one service one that can also be used as part of another service. So which means the code can be reused and shared across the multiple services available as part of your particular application, and all the code and all the services together can be used by multiple other controllers. Okay, what are all the various types of services we have? The first thing is that we usually categorize into two types. One is built-in services, which are usually part of Angular framework, which means AngularJS by default comes with its own services. And those services you will be calling them as built-in services. And if you watched my previous video, we have been using $HTTP for AJAX based communications. So whenever you are using AJAX based communications, there is quite a bit of a chance like you might be using $HTTP. And if you are using $HTTP, which means you are using $HTTP service. This itself is a service. Log is a service, location is a service, and we have bunch of other services which are available as part of Angular framework. So the moment you have AngularJS included as part of your application, you already have all of those services in place, and you can make use of those services in order to develop your AngularJS application. And all those built-in services come as part of Angular framework. The other category is custom services. So which means you will be developing your own services based on your necessity. So which means those particular built-in services provided by Angular framework may not be enough for our particular scenario, and we might be developing our own particular services as necessary. So those particular services usually be again in the form of utilities or business logic services. So business logic services will never be part of built-in services, as because Angular framework doesn't know anything about any business or domain. So if we need to have our own business or domain to be maintained and provided in the form of a service, that needs to be in the form of a custom service. So these custom services, even though those are being developed by us, those could also be extended from existing built-in services, or we can have our own particular business logic services to be developed, and not necessarily with just business logic alone. We can also develop our own utility services if necessary. So especially we have two types of service types. One is built-in, which comes, where all of those come with Angular framework, and custom services which will be developed by us. And as part of this video, we are going to concentrate mostly on custom services, but not on the built-in services. So in order to develop custom services, there are certain rules and regulations we need to follow. So we'll be coming across those now. So before even jumping on how to develop the custom services, we need to understand the business services a bit. So whenever I am saying business services, these are again nothing but the custom services, except that these fall into the category of business logic services. So business logic services again are nothing but the custom services. So where do they really sit? So imagine I have a markup, so which means I have the HTML markup with my own Angular views or templates defined, and we know that we are going to have an Angular module which will always be created at the very beginning, and we are going to have a couple of controllers to be created as part of the same module. So you can have multiple controllers sitting in the same module, and your particular views will be continuously in touch with the controllers. So the responsibility of the controllers is something like they make up a model, provide that model as data to this particular view, and the view gets refreshed. Similarly, if you have any view with any input elements like text boxes, check boxes, radio buttons, and so on, that information, whatever the user has provided, will be again taken back to the controller using scope. So we have already seen all of those particular ways. So what is so special about this? Now comes the services. Till now we never created the services, or say business logic services. So we have to understand, like whenever we would like to have any kind of business logic to be maintained, the business logic needs to be always sitting in the form of services. So as part of the same module, we are going to create multiple services, or say Angular services objects, and those particular services will be used by the controllers, and the responsibility of the services is to actually communicate with the respective web services. So which means if your particular business logic and the database storage and all the respective calculations are being maintained at the server, and those particular services or say web services are being exposed, then usually the communication between the web service and your particular AngularJS module will be handled by your business logic services. So that is important. Your services, your business logic services are the responsible objects or responsible units where the responsibility will be in order to communicate with this particular HTTP based REST based services. So this is very important. So whenever you have any web services exposed and you would like to consume those web services, make sure that you are actually developing the business services and use the same business services as part of your controllers, and the controllers finally will be receiving the models from the services, and you will be putting all the models in whatever the way the view wants them and send those particular modules across to the view. And similarly, if the user provides any information to the view, the same thing will be carried back to the controller. And if that data needs to be saved, you will be sending the same information back to the service, and service gets in touch with the web service, and finally that information will be stored to the database. So this is how a typical AngularJS application will be really developed. Okay, now comes how exactly we can develop a custom service. So there are multiple ways in order to develop a custom service. So basically we are going to cover three different ways on developing custom services. The first one is a factory. So what do you mean by a factory? So do not consider on the factory patterns and whatever, even though it is similar to the factory pattern. This is somewhat very much close to the AngularJS way of developing the custom services here. But whenever I'm talking about factory, I am talking about a code, something similar to this. So what exactly is this code? So you can see we are actually creating an Angular app here, and now we have the controller. You can see that the controller EMP working with the scope, and I called something like calculate factory. And what exactly is this calculate factory? So you can see I have calculate factory defined with app.factory, just like app.controller, app.module, angular.module. We have something called app.factory. So app.factory means you are going to define a particular factory, or you are going to define a unit of code, and that particular code is nothing but your particular service object. And this particular service object, whatever you are going to define here, can contain business logic, and that particular object will be returned back finally to your particular controller in the form of a parameter. So this is important. Now you can see here I'm actually creating an empty object of JavaScript. So calculate service is just an object, and to the same object I'm adding a function, and you can add as many number of members as possible here, and finally you are returning the same object whatever you have created, and that particular object will be directly returned to this particular parameter. And once that is made available, you can see you are actually using those particular members right inside your controller. So this is your particular service object, and this particular service object will be served through the factory model. So factory here is just a model on how you are going to send your particular service object to the controller. So whenever I say model, do not consider the database model, not the data model here. It is just the methodology. So factory in this case is just like a pattern which actually creates a service object, associates that particular object with all the members, which includes the business logic and so on, and finally return that particular object back to the controller. So this is one way of developing a service, and essentially this particular function or any of those members can really communicate with your HTTP services or say REST services. So hopefully we are familiar with factory here. There is one more thing called service oriented. So The first way is factory, the second way is service itself. So let us not confuse ourselves this service with this service. You are still going to develop custom services using another methodology called service. And you can see this is pretty similar to our factory earlier. Again, we have the Angular module, we have the EMP based controller, and instead of factory I am calling this one as calculate service. And you can see instead of using app.factory you are using app.service. So you can see the same thing, whatever you are using here will be automatically being used here as well, and all your particular business logic will be written right here. So unlike previous thing, you are actually creating a particular object. You can see we are actually creating a JavaScript object and then add all the members, then return that particular object. But in the current case, we are not actually creating an object here. We are adding all the members directly to this service definition itself, just like the controller. So the service name is calculate service, and it has got this particular function constructor. You can consider this one as the constructor functions, which I covered in my advanced JavaScript videos. So this particular constructor function will be automatically instantiated and finally will be sent to this particular calculate service parameter. So this is important. So whatever the code you write in here is nothing but the business logic, and the instance of this particular constructor function will be automatically created by AngularJS framework, and finally that instance will be sent to calculate service parameter. So the only difference between this and the previous one is, in the factory you create the object and you return the object. In the case of service, you are not going to create the object, you are just going to define the structure of the object, and AngularJS takes care about how to create the instance when necessary for this particular service and return the instance back to that particular calculate service parameter of the controller. So in this case, the instantiation of the service will be taken care by AngularJS. In the case of factory, it is our responsibility to create an instance and return the service instance. So that is the only difference. It is just only the syntactical difference between a factory and service, but not really anything else other than that. So you can see still we are going to use the same do sum, whatever is available here, which is also going to be used here. Again, I am mentioning it is just our own way on selecting either of these two, either factory or service. So whatever the syntax you are comfortable with, you are just good to go ahead with whatever the way you are comfortable with as well. So you will not find any kind of performance or any kind of difference between factory and service from the technical point of view other than the syntax. So the next one is something bit different, that is provider. So provider essentially is another way of developing custom services, but I just wanted to explain a bit more about provider here. Provider is the core methodology where even the factory and the service will be depending upon. So essentially we can say the factory or the service methodologies, either of those two, are actually the wrappers around provider. So which means behind the scenes, whether you work with factory or service, AngularJS actually works with provider. So even though you are not working with the provider, but if you are working with factory or service, you are essentially working with the provider behind the scenes. So this is like a core model or core methodology for defining the custom services. So for some reason, if you are not happy with factory or service, and if you would like to have more customization options to be made available during your execution of your particular service, probably provider is the better way to go. And the most common reason of using providers is especially whenever your service needs to have some kind of configuration to be actually provided. So which means, imagine my particular service gets in touch with a web service or say REST service, and I need to provide an URL. So whenever I'm trying to provide an URL, we cannot hardcode that particular URL as part of our factory or service. It needs to be configured. Whenever I say configured, we are going to provide some kind of configuration information or settings or some initialization settings to our particular service before even it gets instantiated. So which means before our service gets instantiated, I need to provide some configuration information for which my service can depend upon it. And in order to provide such kind of configuration information, which will be taken dynamically at the very beginning of the service itself, provider will be really helping us for us. So whenever you have any kind of configuration information which needs to be sent to a service, provider is the better way to go. If you do not have any configuration information to be sent, then factory or service will be really working for you. And in order to choose between factory and service, it is just your preference and whatever the way you feel happy with the syntax. Okay, let us see what is provider. And you can see it has got more code than factory and service, as because it needs to work with configuration information as well. So this is again pretty much similar. I have the controller, I have the scope and calculate service. And now instead of using app.factory or app.service, I am using app.provider. And at the same time, you can see at the very bottom you also have app.config. So which means this particular configuration really works at the app level. So this is very important. So what happens at this particular level? So configuration provider for the service. So your particular service, and if this particular service needs any configuration information, this is the provider. So which means you can just consider this is the configuration provider for your service. And this gets executed at the very beginning of your AngularJS application. So even before your particular controller and even before your service, this gets registered. And that's the reason you call this one as config stage. So this will be executed at the config stage even before any of the AngularJS services are in place. So which means $HTTP, $log, nothing will be available at this moment. So that is pretty important. So this will be registered way before than having any of those controllers, providers or other services in place. And you are actually registering that particular provider. You are not executing anything, you are just registering it, saying that this is the function which needs to be executed whenever that particular service is getting instantiated. So this is important, and it is just the naming convention. You can see I provided calculate service here, and you have to provide the same name here followed by provider. Provider is a built-in word here. It follows the convention, naming convention. You cannot change this. You can change this however, but it is important that this name provider needs to be the successive part of your particular service name. So your service name here should be matching with this one and must be followed by the provider here. So once your particular configuration provider is registered, then comes your particular calculation service which needs to be instantiated, as because imagine the controller is getting instantiated. So whenever the controller is getting instantiated, you are saying that please get calculator service to be in place. So now we are saying that calculate service needs to be instantiated. And whenever this particular calculate service needs to be instantiated, our particular AngularJS has already registered this part. So before this particular provider, whenever AngularJS tries to find the word provider, it knows that there exists a kind of provider already registered with the same name followed with the provider, and it brings this one into the picture. So which means it tries to execute this particular function the moment it tries to instantiate the service here. So whenever we are executing the function here, this is essential. You are calling the method config, and that config is right here. So this config is nothing but this config. So you are saying that this particular part needs to be executed automatically by AngularJS whenever you are trying to instantiate your service. So whenever you are trying to instantiate your service, your particular provider gets executed. So which means this function gets executed, and this, as part of this function, you can see you are calling a method called config, and that particular config method is right here, and you are passing some configuration information here like some URL, and that particular URL is being sent as parameter here, and you are storing that URL as part of your private variable for this particular function here. So you can see even this function is actually a constructor function, and this particular constructor function has got something like a method config. So in general, what happens is that AngularJS creates an instance of this particular constructor function, which is nothing but an object, and that particular object will be thrown here, and that particular object, you can see we are actually calling the method on the same object by sending that particular information, and that particular configuration information will be sent into the respective variable, and the same variable whatever you are writing here or maintaining here can be used as part of your particular service definition. So which means this base URL can be used right here or in any of those members related to this particular object. And what is this object? This is very similar to our factory object whatever we have created. So this is your service object. So as part of factory model or factory methodology, you might have seen like I have been creating a service object that is nothing but a plain JavaScript object and adding all the members and finally returning that particular service object. So the same thing. So $get is a built-in part or a built-in word as part of your particular AngularJS, and that is going to be executed automatically by AngularJS framework whenever that particular controller needs an instance of that particular calculate service. So again, in simple, the controller tries to instantiate the calculate service, and calculate service, as AngularJS finds that calculate service in the form of a provider, it tries to find the provider which is already registered earlier, creates an instance of this constructor function, sends that object here, executes the method which is nothing but the one available as part of your constructor function, provides all the configuration information into the parameters here, and have that configuration information stored as part of the same provider instance. And once we have that configuration information stored, then AngularJS executes $get automatically, which essentially creates a new service instance which can make use of all that configuration information as part of the same service here, finally returns the service back to that particular calculator service. So you are not getting the instance of this one. Our controller receives the instance of this particular calculate service, which includes all the business logic, and that business logic depending on the configuration information you might have provided earlier using your configuration provider, or say your provider or service provider. And you can see now you can still work with doSum as part of your controller, and whenever you call doSum, that doSum is going to be executed, and that doSum can essentially use that configuration information whatever you might have provided. So if you are not using this configuration information or configuration settings which need to be passed in future or necessary, you don't really need to use a provider. You can just keep yourself to factory or service. So most of the time the HTTP services or REST services need to have some kind of configuration information to be maintained, and in order for that it is always good to go with the providers rather than factories or services. But again, it is up to our choice. So now that we have some understanding about AngularJS services and how to develop custom services using factory service and also the provider service, let us see on how we can really implement it as part of our code. So this is following my previous sample. So I have two files here. One is d3htm. So let me actually duplicate this. So I'm going to call this one as t01, and the next one is going to be t01 as well. and let me change this one to T01. Okay, so this is a very simple HTML page, and I have a very simple Angular application here which essentially has three members. So that is, I mean, the scope has three members, A and B, and also do sum, and A and B are directly being made available here in the form of evaluation expressions, and those are also bound through our input text boxes. And do sum is the method which will be executed the moment you click on the button. So as part of that particular button, you can see I'm actually calculating sum of those A and B members. So you can see I'm just converting A and B. Let me take this one. So I'm just converting A and B to integers, and finally placing the result into sum, which is going to be a member of scope, and that particular sum is directly being made available right here. So let us quickly check on how this is working. So again, I just wanted to mention there is no HTTP service communication happening here. So all of this code is going to be executed at client side or say browser side. And imagine this is our business logic. Okay, so let me open or let me execute my IS on this particular test. And I would like to say t01.html, and now you can see I have 10 and 20. Those are nothing but A and B values. Now I can change this one to 78 and 23 and click on calculate. Now you can see I have sum to be automatically calculated. And if you open my network here, and if you change anything here and click calculate, you can see, oh, this is also this. That is coincidental. Okay, now if I click calculate, you can see there is no network based communication happening here. Everything is happening at client side and with automatic data binding capabilities. Okay, so now that we have that particular simple code, now is the time actually to jump into our particular custom service provider, custom service development. So as part of our particular development, as I mentioned earlier, the first thing is that we need to work with factory methodology. And I would like to have this particular, code to be actually extracted from the controller and pushed to the service. So which means, as I mentioned earlier, controller is not supposed to have any kind of business logic. The job of the controller is to receive the data from the service and provide that data straight to the view. So this controller needs to be as simple as possible and as thin as possible. So in order to create my particular service, as I mentioned earlier, I need to have a particular factory to be created. So I'm not going to change my T01 HTML. So I will be just throwing that one like that. The first thing is that I need to have the factory to be created. So the factory name in this case, I would like to call this one as calculate factory. And if you'd like to have any other services here, probably you can use them. For example, if I would like to use HTTP as part of my calculate factory, probably you can use it. Similarly, if I would like to have something like $log, I would like to use that one too. If you are using those two, we know that we need to have those two to be also used as part of our particular function. So I'm using the same variables. So you can just put H or L also here, but just to make sure that we are having a better understanding. So let me remove this for our better understanding. So I created a factory here, and of course I need to provide some definition of the factory here. But prior to that, how do I use this particular calculate factory right here? So we know that we are already using scope, and on top of that we are going to use calculate factory as well. So I need to add even the calculate factory here, and as I mentioned, I will be using the calculate factory here as well. So that is important. And the next thing is that I already have do sum, which is fine. So I do not want this particular part to be executed here, as because that needs to be made available as part of my particular factory. So I'm going to get rid of that and provide that particular, separate that business logic into the factory or it's a service. So the first thing I would like to say is something like log instantiating something like calculate factory. So just to have some information, like it is actually creating a service instance using the factor here, and now I'm going to create that particular JavaScript object, which is nothing but our service object, and I'm going to call this one as something like calculator service here. And similarly, now I'm going to use calculate service, which can essentially give me the sum of A and B. So let us see on how I can define this. So later I'm actually going to return this particular object called calculate_service. So this is important. As I mentioned in my previous, the presentation there, you need to create a service object, add all the members to the service object, and finally return that particular object, and that service object will be directly made available here. And now you can say, like I can say, call calculate factory dot get sum. Sorry, this is the one you can straight away use. So I can just say get sum and provide those two values. In this case, I have $scope.a and $scope.b. So what am I trying to accomplish here? So I already have A and B. Those two values you are actually sending to your service, and you can see I have those two values automatically captured as part of A and B here. And of course, once that is done, all I can simply do is something like return, I can say A plus B here. And once that is done, I can simply make sure that $scope.sum equal to this. And let us see if this is working. So let me go back, let me refresh this whole thing. Okay, no errors till now, and you can see like instantiating calculate factory. So this is the message what we already wrote as part of this one. So which means our service has been already instantiated and sent as part of the controller. And if you do not have this particular controller referring our calculate factory, this will never be executed. So for now, let us consider I'm not using this. And I'm not using this either. And I just refreshed this. Now you can see I did not get instantiating calculate factory at all. So that is what I call it as lazily loading. So loading your particular service definition in a laziest manner, which means this whole part will be executed, loaded and executed if and only if you are actually referring that through some kind of controller. So let me save this again, and I just refresh this, and you can see it is automatically instantiated. Why? Because our controller reverses it. And now let me try to click on this, and now you can see I got calculate, which is nothing but 30. So if I have 80 here and if I have 90 here, the moment I say calculate, you can say, oh, I did a mistake here. It is actually concatenating 90 plus 80. So I have a bug, which essentially means nothing but I need to convert my particular value of A to an integer, and at the same time convert the value of B also to an integer, then do the sum. So that is a bug. Let me refresh this again. Now I need to say 90 and 80 and click calculate, and now you can see I have 70. And again, as I mentioned, everything is happening at the client side. There is no network based communication happening here. Everything is happening at the client side, which means the calculation, the execution, and all the data binding is happening at the browser level. Now let us extend this a bit. Now we have already extracted our business logic into a separate service, and our controller need not be touched again. And you can say I already stopped touching my HTML, and even I can stop my our controller as well. So if you have any kind of modifications to be done to your business logics, just do right here as part of this particular method, and you need not do anything else other than that. And there are a couple of ways if you would like to have some kind of asynchronous execution as well. For example, in this case, this is synchronous, which means this particular expression will be waiting till our particular get sum returns some value. That is important. So our particular function get sum is going to be executed right here. And imagine this is taking 5 seconds to execute. this particular statement will be waiting there for 5 seconds. So which means this statement cannot go to the next line until and unless it completes the evaluation of this one. So if your particular business logic function takes 10 seconds to execute, you will not have the next statement to be executed until and unless that whole 10 seconds has been completed and you received a value from this particular method. So that might not be a good idea whenever you are developing JavaScript based applications. So it is always better to have some kind of asynchronous way of developing things. So for that purpose, the easiest way for now, of course there are several ways to achieve this, but for now, in order to make our particular video simple here, I would like to introduce a callback function. So I can say something like this. Okay, let me comment this a bit so that we know what we are doing and what are all the differences we are actually making use of. And I am going to comment this one too right now. Okay, now I am going to change my definition of getSum in such a way that it could be executed in an asynchronous fashion. So in an asynchronous fashion means I will not worry about when it is going to return the value. However, once it is returned, I need to have my sum to be populated. So I do not want to care like I have to really wait for 5 minutes or 5 seconds or 10 seconds. So for that purpose, the easiest way to use is callback functions. So I am going to say getSum equal to function a comma b comma a callback function. So make sure that this is not a reserved word. This is just another variable. This is callback. In my opinion, this stands for callback. You can put any variable like x. It doesn't matter. So just to make things simple, I just wanted to introduce a callback function here. So if you are not familiar with callback functions, please refer my advanced JavaScript videos. So as part of this particular callback function, all I'm going to say is please execute my callback function, whatever I'm going to send, with a particular value in this fashion. So which means I am saying that please calculate my particular result. So let me make this one more understandable. So I am going to have something like variable s equal to the sum of those two, and call your particular function, whatever you are going to provide here, with that particular value s. So how I am going to execute this service is right here. So I am going to say please execute my calculate factory and also execute my getSum, and I am going to provide these values as well, and those two values are going to be the ones for a and b. However, I need to send a callback function, so which means this could be any anonymous function or whatever the function you must have already defined earlier, which will be receiving some kind of result. So you can provide any kind of variable here. So if you want to provide r, that is also good. So this particular r is nothing but the value whatever it is going to receive from s. So this cb is a callback function, which means you are essentially passing this whole function as parameter, and that whole function will be made available as part of cb. And when you are calling cb, you are actually calling this function, and if you are sending any value, that value will be made available as part of r. And as part of this, I can say $scope.sum equal to r. So let us see if this is working. So I refresh this, and you can see it has instantiated successfully. So in this case, I would like to provide 89 and click calculate, and now you can see it has done this one too. So this is a preferred way for actually executing any kind of operations which are available as part of your service. You think in the form of asynchronous rather than in a synchronous way. So synchronous means this particular statement will not be, that statement will be always waiting in order to get it completed. It will never go to the next statement. But in this case, it executes this and immediately it follows to the next statement. And later, once this has completed, it is going to execute this one, which essentially receives your particular data. So for more information, you check my callback functions later. And this is a kind of asynchronous way of execution, and there are several other ways to execute your particular operations in an asynchronous manner, like $Q or whatever, but in this case I just wanted to make it simple. Okay, now let us take this to the next level. Imagine I would like to have this particular getSum to be executed by actually calling a REST service. So which means I have an HTTP REST service which essentially calculates this at the server side, and the web service returns the value to the sum. So let me take in that direction. So in order for that, I need to have a REST service to be executed. So I already have my REST service developed as part of my previous video. So currently I'm using Node. You can also use a web API, both are same. So I developed web API and Node API as part of my previous video, but as part of this video I would like to use Node API. All I have to do is just execute this particular service that is in the form of REST. So I'm going to open my particular command prompt, and I'm going to say please execute my particular web service, and have that web service listening at port number 4467. So what does it say? 4467. Let me use my Postman here and quickly see what it is doing. So all this is covered as part of my previous video. So you can see localhost 4467 has got something like sum, and I can provide values 20 or 30, and the moment I click on that, you can see I'm getting the values 50. So this is a web service which has been developed as part of my previous video. So I can say something like 60 and 20 and click send, which is going to give me 80. So I'm going to use this particular service as part of my AngularJS application. So instead of having my calculations to be done locally at browser level, I would like to defer this calculation or business logic calculation to be deferred to the web service. So for that, it is going to be very similar code to what I wrote earlier. That is calculate service dot get sum, and again I am going to have a comma b, and also we'll be having a callback function. So this is the definition. The definition will be pretty similar. However, the code whatever I am going to write now is going to use $HTTP in order to communicate with AJAX. So for that purpose I'm using $HTTP. So I'm going to communicate with my web service using $HTTP in an AJAX fashion. So all this has been covered as part of my previous video. So now I'm going to execute my particular AJAX with those options, and if it completes successfully, then I would like to have this particular function to be executed. If it fails, I would like to have another function to be executed. And now let us provide the options. So as part of these options, the first thing is that I need to provide the URL. So as part of my Postman, you can see this is the URL, and I would like to use the same URL as part of my AngularJS. So where is this? I go in here, I provide the URL. But as you know, I cannot hardcode these values, is because I'm already receiving those values as part of these variables. So I just provide the same variables here, and at the same time I provide the same variable b here. So in that way I have my URL already set, and I am going to use get method in order to communicate with my AJAX web service. So this is what I have as part of my AJAX execution, and this is the function which gets executed when I have a success return. So which means this is the function, or say we can also call this one a success function, and this is a failure function. So which means our AJAX request, if it fails, this function gets executed. If our AJAX gets successful, this function gets executed, which also contains our response. So in this case, I would like to say something like callback. So as I mentioned, just like this. So I am using the same callback function, and I am going to send my particular data right here. And if you'd like to have any kind of a $log service to be used, you can say something like response.data. So which means if you would like to see what kind of data you received from server, probably we can also say $log if necessary. If there exists any other problem or it fails, probably I would like to provide something like error occurred as part of my console log. Okay. But there is one more important thing I would like to mention here. You are using $HTTP and $log. So which means your factory should also be using those two. If you are not providing these two, then these two will not work. For these, you do not need these two to be involved. So these two are necessary if and only if you are using this. If you are not writing log here, you do not necessarily use $log here. Okay. So now I created the object, provided the method which essentially communicates with the service, and once the web service returns the data, this is the function which gets executed, and as part of that I am actually calling the callback function, and then you can see I have response.data there. So this response.data, whatever I receive from the web service, will be automatically sent to this callback function, and I get the result into the variable sum. And let us see if all of this is working fine. Okay, I don't have any errors. You can see it has calculated factory instantiated, and now let me provide some value, something like 78 and 89, and click on calculate. And now you can see I have 167 calculated, and you can also see how it has been communicating with the REST service with the same URL I have provided. So if I provide something like 90 and 23 and click on calculate, now you can see there is one more request called 90 and 23, and as part of the response you can see I'm having 113, and the same response is being logged as part of my console, and I'm assigning the same thing to the sum as well. Okay, so this is pretty much what I have as part of the factory. So which means I extracted my logic or business logic from my controller into the service, and my service can really talk to the web service, get all the data and send the data back to my controller, and my particular controller will be responsible to put all that information into the scope so that my HTML or my particular view gets bound to the respective scope using data binding. Okay, so let me duplicate this, and I call this one as T02. So I close this, and I would like to modify this one to 202 right now. Why? Because I am going to develop something new as part of T02, and instead of using calculate factory, I am going to use calculate service now. So this is the second type what I mentioned earlier as part of my presentation. So in order to use calculate service, the first thing, as I mentioned, is instead of using app.factory, I have to use app.service. And to be consistent with our naming, instead of using calculate factory, I would like to mention this one as calculate service. So whenever I use this, I need to use this here also. I need to use this here. I need to use this here, here, here. And looks like those are all the ways I can provide. And let me do one by one. So I would like to have this whole thing to be removed as well. So let us do one by one so that we know what we're doing. So we don't, first of all, I don't need to create any kind of object as part of the service methodology. So this object is not necessary, and a return is also not necessary. So that's the first thing. And the next thing is that, as I mentioned, this function itself behaves as if this is a constructor function. So instead of providing an object and a member, you can directly provide the member. So in this case, I can just say something like this dot get sum equals function a comma b. So this is the way on how I can develop the function. The only difference is that I'm using this. So which means I'm using this constructor function which will have get sum, and that particular method is going to be automatically made available through calculate service, because the instance of this service will be automatically created by AngularJS. So as part of this, it is pretty simple for me. All I have to do is just do this. And in order to test that one, I do not need this kind of syntax. Why? Because this is synchronous way of executing things. So I'm not using any callback here. So this is synchronous. So I just use this and let us check if this is working. So I refresh this, and now let us see you are having t02.js loaded, and let us see if this is working. So now you can see I have 30, which is working fine. So let me again comment this and comment this. Okay, before even commenting this, let me copy this a bit. So this is my previous one, and of course I do not need this. Let me forget about this. So in order to use my asynchronous way of executing things, I have to use a callback function. So in order to have a callback function, this is very similar to whatever I have accomplished here. So let me do the same thing. So I will be just removing this part, and instead of this I will be providing this and remove this whole part. So I'm using the same way, this dot get sum, I'm using the same thing here, a comma b, and in fact I have a callback function here. So let us check if this is working fine. So again, let us remember refreshing this, and you can see this is automatically created, and I'm using t02, and the moment I click on this, you can see I have 30 to be executed with no problems. So as I mentioned, this is just a syntactical sugar. So again, now I need to talk to my HTTP service. So for that purpose, all I had to do is something like just get rid of this whole part, and now as part of this, all I have to write is this. So the moment I write it, you can see that I'm using the same function with HTTP and log, trying to communicate with the same service, and let us see if this is working fine. So I refresh this and I clear everything, and let us try to calculate it, and now you can see it is actually trying to get in touch with our particular web service, and the web service results the value 30, which has been logged, and the same value is being available here. So if I press 90 and click 90 calculate, and now you can see 10 and 90 becomes 100 right here. So this is just another way of developing your service using service methodology rather than factory methodology. Okay, so let me duplicate this a bit. So instead of duplicating, probably it is better for me to rewrite this whole part. Probably, okay, let me duplicate this and get rid of this service all the way. So let me duplicate this, and I call this one as T3 right now. And before even doing anything else, I would like to make sure that this is T3 so that it loads it. And I would like to use the same kind of syntax whatever I have in place, and let me get rid of this whole service. So this is clean right now. Okay, and again, imagine I would like to have everything commented. Okay, now is the third way, that is provider. So we have seen factory and the service, and now it is time for the provider. So let us see how the provider can be done. So as I mentioned, first of all, we need to have the configuration to be provided. So in this case, I would like to call this one as something like app.config, and as part of this, I would like to have the calculate service. As I mentioned, it has to be the same name as you are following, calculate service, and it has to be followed with provider. This is essential. You cannot change this. Your particular service name needs to be followed with provider, and then you can use the same kind of variable like calculate service provider. Essentially, you are following the same syntax whatever you used here right here, and this is the function. So as part of this, as you know, I can provide any kind of configuration information here, but now For now, I am not providing any information, but this is just an empty configuration for now. So I do not want to do any kind of configuration right here, but just leave it like that for now. And now I am going to have the provider. So just like in T01, you can see I provided app.factory, and in T02 I provided app.service, and in this case I am providing app.provider, and now I have to use calculate service, which needs to be the same thing. I have to use calculate service, service, and also calculate service right here. And now I am going to say this is the function which needs to be executed. So as part of this function, as I mentioned, this is again a constructor function, and this particular constructor function is going to have a provider instance. So whatever the constructor function you are going to write here is not a service, it is the provider you are going to write. So as part of this, I can say something like this dot dollar get equal to function, and as I mentioned earlier, this is the function which will be automatically executed. $get will be executed automatically by AngularJS. So as part of this, I can copy and paste the same code whatever I have as part of my factory. So which means essentially you're going to create a service object, and at the same time you can provide something like this, which is nothing but you are going to calculate, hold on. So you are having a method called getSum to be provided, and at the same time return calculate service. So this is essentially the same thing. You are using the same factory based method here, and currently I'm not providing any configuration information, so it is as good as your factory. So there is no difference between factory and provider here, as because you are not using any special configuration which needs to be passed in here. So however, you are using provider based syntax rather than factory based syntax here. So in order to use this, as I mentioned, I had to just get rid of this guy and see if that is working first. So let me double check if everything is properly written. So calculate service, I have all the definition of the calculate service. Here I'm actually creating calculate service object, which essentially has your getSum, where A and B are going to be passed right here. Return this and save. This is working. So T03 is being used, T03 is being used. So let me refresh this, and I have no problems executing this. So now the moment I click calculate, you can see I have 30 here and I have 90 right there. So in that way, I have my particular provider being written from the scratch in the form of factory. As I mentioned, if you do not like this kind of syntax, go with factory straight away. And the next thing is that imagine I would like to use $log here as part of this. So which means as part of this provider, I wanted to use log service. It is pretty important that whenever you would like to use some external services as part of your provider, those need to be part of $get, but not right inside the provider, as because this part will be executed way before, which means during the config stage itself. So that is the reason you cannot provide or use the other services right here. Why? Because those will not be available at the time of this provider execution. However, this will be executed at later stage, for which you can make use of your particular services. So I can say I would like to use something like this, and as part of this one I wanted to use $log and use the same thing like L or $log for better readability. And now I can say something like $.log instantiating calculate service, and let us see if it is actually using the calculate service right there. And now you can see I have the $log service, which is automatically made available. So let us go to the next level. I would like to use this particular function, which is nothing but callback function. So instead of using this one in a synchronous manner, I would like to use asynchronous way of coding. So for that purpose, I would like to use something like this. So you can see I'm using the same definition, however I'm using a callback function. So if you're using a callback function, you have to use this way in order to execute your particular application. So let me save everything and let us see if this is working fine. So instantiating calculate service is done, and I click calculate, and you can see I have 30 as well here. So you do not need to have any kind of HTTP service as part of this one. Why? Because everything is happening at the client. So let us now go to the next level by actually introducing our HTTP service as well. So this is going to be something like this. So let me comment this, and I'm using this right here, and let us see if this is going to work fine. And still again I'm not using configuration. This is empty. I'm not sending any configuration information yet. So let me save this and see if this is working fine. So let me refresh this. Let me clear the network, and the moment I click on this, okay, I got an error. Oh, this is important, $HTTP. So I forgot that. You can see in order to use $log service, I defined $log, and I'm now using $HTTP. So I have to use $HTTP as well. And that is the reason it threw back on my face. So I have to use $HTTP as well. I refresh this. Let me remove everything and click on calculate, and now you can see there is a network request here, and I have the value returned back from the service, and I can provide as many number of times as possible. So you can say I have 100 here, and I have 10 and 90 as well. Okay, so this is still looking as if we are writing factory, but we haven't taken the chance to configure our particular provider. So we need to have the provider to be actually accepting some kind of configuration information. So in this case, imagine this URL, whatever I'm using, not supposed to be hard-coded as part of my particular service. So imagine if my particular service has got multiple other methods, we will be hard-coding this HTTP localhost everywhere, and that is not a good idea. So we have to configure this at one location and reuse the same thing over and over again for all of those particular methods or the service operations we are going to provide. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do is so let me start here. Okay, I have to start here. So first of all, I would like to say some kind of a variable like base URL, and this base URL will be looking something like this. And now you can see I can use the same variable right here. So this is the simplest way, and again I'm hard coding it here. So all I'm doing is I'm just actually, so you can see this sits above $get. That is important. That's the first thing. So I'm defining a variable which contains this particular URL, and I'm using the same variable as part of my particular $get and as part of my service object. So this is my service object which has an operation called getSum, and it is going to use this particular variable whatever I have earlier, that is base URL, and the same thing whatever I have provided here will be placed here. So this is not configured yet, but just wanted to show you. So again I refresh this, and let us see if this is working fine. I clear everything and calculate it, and you can see still it is able to do whatever it did earlier. So except that this is coming from the variable. And now I would like to have this base URL to be actually sent from the configuration. So I do not want to send this. I do not want to hard code it. Instead, I would like to have that one to be sent. So I can say something like this .config. You can provide anything here, or I can say like set or this .settings, for example. You can provide anything, whatever you would like to provide here. This .settings or this .config, anything. So it makes more sense for me in this case like this. Function. And you can provide any number of parameters here, or even a JSON object. For now all I have is only one parameter, and that's the reason I just use URL here. So now whenever I provide any kind of configuration information through this value, I will be assigning this value straight to the base URL. So I'm going to say base URL equal to URL. And who is going to call this guy? That is where this guy really does. So AngularJS will be creating an instance of this whole function. AngularJS will be creating an instance of this whole function, and that is a constructor function anyway. That whole instance will be made available as part of this guy, which means this has access to this particular config method. So now I can say this one dot config. So you can use settings or config or whatever, and now here you can provide your particular HTTP URL. So the moment I come in here, now I can provide right here. So what I'm saying here is that execute config method, which is nothing but this guy. I'm providing a value, something like this, that is going to be made available here, assigned here. So once everything is done, and you can see all of this happens, and all of this happens way before during the config stage. So it will not be executed whenever you are trying to instantiate it. It will be executed at the very beginning of AngularJS itself. So that is the reason the configuration will be taken place always at the very beginning, and later on $get gets executed, and $get gets executed if and only if you are using it as part of a controller or referring it in the form of a service. And whenever this gets executed, anyway you are using base URL, by that time it has been already configured and assigned with the URL, and the same URL will be reused as part of your application. So I refresh this, let me clear all these things, and again I click on this, and now you can see I have this guy. So just for our better understanding, let us consider I am modifying to some other port number which is not really available. So I'm just saying 44671, it is not available, so it should throw an error. So let me refresh this, clear everything, and click on calculate. Okay, and now you can see it was trying to actually go through 44671, and you can see it threw an error saying that connection refused, and this is the error whatever the message we put as part of our particular function. So if you click on here, you can see this is our function. Sorry, not this one. Let me go back. So error occurred is our particular message. So if you go back here, you can see error occurred. This is the same message whatever we placed here. Okay, so this is pretty much about the provider. So in that way, the T01, we provided factory based methodology in order to work with custom service, T02 service based methodology, T03 provider based methodology. However, the provider will have the flexibility of configuring your particular service as necessary.